Hi, everyone. Welcome to Lessons from Labor Organizers. We're going to be doing kind of a moderated Q&A panel at the beginning, and then halfway through we're going to switch into kind of an open mic audience Q&A, so be thinking about your questions leading up to that. My name is Emma Kanema. I'm a labor organizer with Game Workers Unite, and I'm joined today by Justin Melito, the Director of Organizing of the Writers Guild of America East, Liz Schuler, the Secretary-Treasurer of the AFL-CIO, Linda Dow, a labor organizer with SAG-AFTRA, and Kevin Agawatse, the Treasurer and organizer with Game Workers Unite UK Union. It's a great group of people. So before we jump into any questions, I think we might just go down the row and do a brief self-introduction, maybe expand on what your title actually means in terms of the work you do. Justin, do you want to start?
Sure. Hello, and thank you so much to Game Workers Unite and to all of you who are so interested in the idea of collective action and perhaps building unions in your industry. My name is Justin Melito. I'm the Director of Organizing for the Writers Guild of America East. What that means is, as an organizer, I work towards helping people who want to build unions in the industries that they work in into the House of Labor. And so specifically at the Writers Guild, we're the union for film and television workers. There's an East Coast and a West Coast union. We also have a large number of news members, about 3,500 members in New York City and the East Coast. Recently, that number is over 5,000 because we've organized about 20 digital publishers. So places like Vice, Vox, Future, Talking Points Memo, Salon, Slate, and a bunch of others have organized with us fairly recently. So that's the work that I've been involved in with a team of organizers, most recently to expand the power of the union to new groups.
Thank you. Liz?
Hi, everyone. Liz Schuler. I'm the Secretary-Treasurer of the National AFL-CIO, which is an umbrella organization of 55 unions. Writers Guild East and SAG-AFTRA are two of those. We represent 12.5 million working men and women in the United States and Canada, and we are working across all industries and sectors, which are anywhere from professional football players to professional technical engineers, to teachers and construction workers. And my role is basically as an organizer as well, came from my local union out of the electrical workers. And we are excited to talk about the future of work and what that means for working people, what this country is starting to look like in terms of employment and getting your fair share of the wealth that you create on the job.
Linda?
Hi, I'm Linda. I'm an organizer with SAG-AFTRA. Right now I work closely with voice actors that work in video games, foreign language dubbing, and TV animation. So I deal with new organizing and internal organizing. So new organizing is similar to what Justin said, where we're trying to organize new shops. But with internal organizing, we also deal with collective actions and building collective power to have leverage while we negotiate existing contracts.
And Kevin?
Hi, I'm Kevin Agawatse. I'm the treasurer of Game Workers Unite UK. We're a very new trade union for games workers in UK. We've partnered up with the IWGB, which is a very young, democratic, militant union, to get into space and improve conditions.
Awesome, thank you. And yeah, thank you again for being on the panel. So I kind of want to start off with, I think probably a question for Kevin. What lessons have you and the other kind of fellow workers and organizers from Game Workers Unite, what lessons have you kind of learned and what obstacles have you been having to overcome as you kind of spin up your new national union and starting to organize game workers?
All right, so as opposed to unionizing shop by shop, we're forming a national union, you sort of have a lot of members, so the most union-friendly in a lot of companies, but we don't necessarily yet have big membership in any particular shop. So it's nice that everybody in the union right now is very active and wants to get involved, but we still need to build like campaigns in all the shops in the UK. And the other sort of thing is we spoke to like a lot of the big and established unions and like the games industry space, where there's a lot of like highly trained professionals that do like very different things, from art to programming, community management, and it is very like globalized, international. It's like a space that traditional unions aren't super sure how to approach yet. Like that's is a space that has been traditionally not unionized, and it is a challenge to figure out how to do it.
Yeah, and I mean, you're talking about spaces that are traditionally not unionized, Justin. You, of course, have quite a bit of experience organizing kind of new territories where workers aren't unionized. Can you maybe expand on some of the challenges involved in that?
Yeah, in 2015, some writers from Gawker Media, just show of hands, do people know about Gawker and maybe the campaign to organize at Gawker? Great. Came to our office because they were interested in organizing a union. And we immediately began to work with them in an approach that in some ways was different than traditional labor organizing approach, and in some ways quite similar. The thing that was different is that the sort of premium on transparency from people that worked at Gawker made for a process that was much more horizontal in terms of how the organizing happened, meaning that all of the decisions and all of the activities were public, and so public, in fact, that they were all on a blog as people were deliberating on whether or not to organize, which is pretty unique. I share that anecdote because the most important lesson really there is to make sure that we listen as organizers and as the labor movement. When we're trained as organizers, we're told we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and therefore we should be doing twice as much listening. So as an institution and as organizers, we listened very closely to what it was that people in the digital media sector were saying. They were talking about overwork, underpay, the precariousness of the industry, some traditional bread and butter labor issues, but they also spoke a lot about diversity and equity and the need for transparency in decision making. And so we emphasized in our communications the importance of that. And in fact, as organizers, really just facilitated the communication that happened as opposed to being the institution and communicating on behalf of the workers. They also had the added benefit of being professional communicators, so it would be pretty foolish for us to redo their communications about why unions were important. And then lastly, one lesson that was extremely important and has maintained throughout is having a movement approach, meaning that we're not talking about just organizing one shop and one place that happens to be either the bad place or the harder place to work. We're talking about organizing the entire industry so that standards are set across the board no matter which company you happen to be working on any given day, which of course, as you know, is very important when in this economy, as people jump from job to job, we no longer live in an economy that people go to work at one factory for 30 or 40 years, they jump from place to place. And so therefore the union effort and movement has to be across all companies, across the entire sector, and really based on the labor as opposed to any given particular company. And then lastly, very much using the technological tools that people use at work, having those tools be used in the organizing campaigns. So use of Slack, use of Twitter campaign, were all very effective for developing solidarity and building strong unions.
Yeah, I feel like Game Workers Unite has also kind of taken up a lot of those approaches, right? Using communication methods that workers are already using, being more flexible, thinking about building movement, and as opposed to just focusing on individual shops. Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think that applies a lot to our industry as well. Linda, so I mean, you do a lot of work in terms of like organizing with voice actors, and I've always been really impressed how voice actors are often directly involved in the organizing campaigns, just in the way that the writers Justin works with have been directly involved. Can you speak to a little bit of that process and maybe touch on how you feel like voice actors and organizing with SAG-AFTRA relates into the larger labor movement within the games industry as a whole?
Sure. So maybe I should start off by giving a little overview of the last interactive negotiations and the strike. So when we were in negotiations 2016, we had been negotiating, trying to reach a new agreement for almost 2 years. So finally, the proposals were too far apart for us to feel that it was a good agreement. So eventually there was, a strike authorization vote, and we did go on strike. And 3 of the main issues were, one was transparency. They wanted to know either the name of the game or the genre, or if there's sexually explicit or racially explicit or violence in the game, so that they can make a decision on whether they want to audition or even work on the game. And secondary payments was a big deal, because with actors, usually they get residuals on other contract areas. And this is a model that works for them because it's not guaranteed that they work every day, not even guaranteed that they work once a month. So having a secondary payment on the back end really helps while they're in between gigs. And the other issue was vocal stress, because a lot of these games, they're exerting themselves, they're screaming, they're dying like a million different ways. So like vocal stress was a big issue, because if they strain their vocal cords too much, they might get bleeding, swelling, might have to get surgery, so that means they can't work if any of those things happen. So that's kind of like the overview, the big issues that they were fighting for. So even while they were negotiating and bargaining for 2 years, they started off doing one-on-ones. So it's basically doing your initial conversations, figuring out who's the leaders in the community, who's really influential, and then building like a leadership structure, kind of like a core group to strategize and reach the larger community to assess support. And they did things where they would do house meetings, they would do caucuses at the offices, smaller group meetings, mixers, and then obviously they had a Facebook group that they would chat with and do education, and they did a newsletter using MailChimp, and just always keeping the community in the loop and educated about everything. And they still do that now, where even though there's no contract, there's no negotiations happening, that they still actively use that Facebook and that newsletter to keep everybody updated. And they're continually doing issue-based organizing, because we couldn't get exact language for what is vocal stress on the contract, that they're continually partnering up with industry professionals to do all-day workshops and evening panels, so that we can look into this even more and figure out, how do we protect voice actors from losing their voice.
And Kevin, so I feel like a lot of what Linda just said is stuff that you all do in the UK, right?
Yeah.
And really it seems to boil down to community building, right? At the end of it, right?
Yeah.
Can you speak to like how community building works into your organizing model in the UK?
There's a lot of those things that we do, right? We have a newsletter that is bi-weekly. We have a Discord where people can speak to us. We are going to have like a weekly meeting just with our membership, where everybody can just join and like ask questions about what we're doing, or ask how they can get involved. We have like regional groups and local meetings once a month in like different regions, so just people can meet up in real life and actually get to know each other. We just constantly communicate what we're doing, and it's like very important, because a lot of people in the games industry have essentially no idea what a union is, how it works and what it does. And it's really important to show how we're helping people, which we actively do, but it can be hard if you're just working somewhere, you're crunching, you're trying to focus on yourself, or maybe on your mental health or your kid. Then it's really hard to actively stay engaged in what the union is doing. So we need to show people the good we're doing.
Yeah, I feel like education has to be a very core component, especially when it comes to these like new territories where people aren't familiar with unionization, they aren't familiar with a lot of the kind of labor rights and things that come with that, right? Liz, I mean, so in a lot of your work, you do a lot of involvement with like, you know, young folks in the industries who are wanting to get into labor and, you know, organizing new territory. What component does like education play in that, and like how does the AFL-CIO play into that, some of those things?
Absolutely, and it's been so interesting to listen to the panelists so far, because I think you're seeing a lot of examples of creative and innovative organizing across different sectors, and I want to compliment Emma, because what you all have done to come together collectively already just since last year, I think it was birthed, right, at this conference. Yes, it's just been tremendous. Because it does take some guts, right, to step out there and talk about these issues, and there's a lot at stake. And what I've been hearing from the panelists so far, the theme is workers taking risks, and workers who want to get a return on the value that they are creating for these companies and in the economy. And I don't think it's a lot to ask when you're in an industry that is 3 times the size of Hollywood for you to be getting a fair return on the work and the risk that you are putting into the product that you're creating. So that is what it means to come together in union, whether it's in a union or collectively in some other form, right? And that's the beauty of this, is the law protects workers who want to come together collectively, no matter what your workplace looks like or what kind of work you do. So that's what the AFL-CIO tries to do as an umbrella organization, is lift up the organizing of the various affiliated unions that belong to the AFL-CIO, but really speaking out for working people across the economy, no matter if you're in a union or not. Because we all deserve basic rights on the job. We all deserve fair pay and protections and equality and transparency and accountability, which was spoken to earlier on the panel as well. And so it really is about this power dynamic, right? And what we're seeing, not just in your industry, but everywhere, is that there seems to be this concentration where the profits are going to a handful of people, and the working people are the ones getting the short end of the stick, not getting the value on the risk and the return that you should be seeing in your work. And so just a couple of quick examples. We're seeing activism unlike we've seen anywhere in a long time, obviously in your industry, but most recently in the hospitality industry. Unite Here is the union that represents hotel and restaurant employees, housekeepers, room attendants, who just went on strike against the most profitable hotel company in the world, Marriott. And they wanted fair wages, of course, and better working conditions, because you can imagine the stress and taxation that is happening to a room attendant who is lifting up, heavy mattresses and dealing with cleaning materials and making sure they have those safety protections on the job. But they also were fighting for protection against sexual harassment because of, guests in the hotels and what they encounter when they are cleaning rooms. Also technology and the introduction of automation in industrial kitchens and robots for when you check into a hotel. They wanted a voice in how that technology was going to be implemented in their industry. So they used their collective bargaining process with their union to have enough power at the table to say, here are our ideas, and this is what we would like to see. So that was an example of workers coming together most recently, along with teachers who have been, out on the picket lines saying, enough's enough. We want better, smaller class sizes in our classrooms, and more school supplies so we don't have to buy them out of our pockets. So I think this is a moment, we're calling it a movement moment, that you're a part of.
Yeah, and I mean, you touched on, hospitality workers, service. There's, burgeoning labor movements, not just in games, but in technology. And you recently published an open letter to game workers, calling on them to unionize and start organizing with one another, and that the time was kind of right for that.
Yeah.
why do you think it is that not just in the games industry, but the kind of really the whole national picture, why do you feel like labor is kind of resurging in this moment? Like, what do you think creates these kind of conditions?
And that kind of ties to your first question about education. I think people are starting to discover that, hey, we don't have to just sit back and take it. We do have a way to fight back. And I think people have a lack of awareness that you can form a union for the most part, or they have old stereotypes about what unions are. I cannot tell you the number of times I get on an airplane and people ask me what I do. And I say, I work for the labor movement. And they either look right back down at their book, or they say, oh, that still exists? I thought that was back in the 30s or whatever, you know, for people who work in steel mills. And yes, that's true, but I think in this moment where our economy is becoming so fluid and work is looking different, and as you were saying about nobody works in one place for 30 years anymore, right? We are experiencing a modernization and a surge in people wanting to come together collectively like we haven't seen before because of what the economy has been doing, right? It's been repressive, and the fairness and equality is absolutely non-existent, and people are feeling very alone. And this is a way to fight back.
Yeah. So in your letter, you know, you're talking about now is the time to organize. How do you feel like, as the Secretary-Treasurer of the AFL-CIO, a national kind of umbrella org of all these different labor movements and unions, how do you imagine game workers and tech workers in general fitting into that national picture? Like, how do you imagine us incorporating into the larger whole?
Well, this is so incredibly exciting because the world is your oyster, right? There is no one particular way to do this. And I think we could benefit from your creativity and your innovation in thinking about what a model could look like. Now, there are models that exist, and I think that could work for this industry as well. I came out of the electrical workers union, right? Where electricians who work in construction are moving from job to job. It's very dynamic, it's very fluid. They get all of their training through the union because they're constantly coming back to the union as a center of gravity. They get their benefits through the union. People think portable benefits is a new conversation. It's not, because for over 100 years, unions have been doing this, right? So that is a model that exists. Now, there could be a model like a guild, for example, that Uber drivers have formed in New York, where they come together and they fight against not only company policies and to be recognized. That's how the tipping policy was changed, actually, with Uber, is the Independent Drivers Guild went to the company and said, this is absolutely locking us out. And then also, certainly with the Taxi Cab Commission and the regulatory framework, they're able to use their guild to leverage that. There could be a model where you might be a member of the AFL-CIO, for example, directly, independently, and we could provide support and infrastructure. But I think the one thing to think about is there's the movement piece of this, but there's also the organization piece of this that's so important. And a lot of people think, yeah, we got a movement, but you also have to have an organization to be able to deliver on the goals of that movement.
Yeah. So I kind of want to make sure we have like a nice, decent chunk of time for audience Q&A. But before we get onto that, I think it'd be really nice to take a moment and, yeah, kind of step back maybe from that larger picture of everything, but to people who are maybe new to the labor movement, people who are new to organizing and talking to their fellow coworkers about these kinds of things, each of you, I'd like to hear just briefly kind of like what maybe a general tip you would just give to someone who's just starting out, and maybe like what first steps would you recommend them kind of following? Justin, do you want to start off?
Yeah, I think that boy, it's hard not to jump in on the economic situation for people in the industry and the big picture. But can I just say one little thing about that is that what's happening is the massive disparity of wealth inequality in this country is, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here, but I feel like it's worth saying that there are a few people that are taking everybody's money and making people work like 60 or 70 hours a week and giving them just enough for them to survive, to continue producing wealth for them. And that's the moment that we're in. That's the moment that this country's been in the past and this world's been in the past. And the solution to that situation is mass organizing into militant, strong labor unions. And that's, I feel like, it is a moment, it is happening, people are doing it, and it's up for institutions to figure out how to interact with that and provide the necessary resources for people that are on the front lines fighting that. And I think that that's also what's really exciting, is that's happening everywhere across our industry, and people are looking to fight back, and we have to figure out how to help support that. And that's not necessarily helpful day-to-day advice, so I will circle back to that and say that beginning to have conversations with people that you know and trust about what's happening at your workspace, what's happening in your working lives, is the best way to start. You know, you'll find that there's obviously tremendous fear about collective action because the corporations that you work for are in a structure where they have most of the power, but you'll also find that when you have open conversations with people who are experiencing the same or very similar situation as you are, that there's going to be tremendous solidarity and tremendous receptiveness to at least talking about those things. So just to elevate the notion of community building, we do a lot of happy hours, we do a lot of coffees, a lot of teas, where people just start breaking down the isolation that they're facing and realizing that it's not just them who are facing these problems, and that it's actually a systemic approach for companies to maximize profit off of your labor. That happens through one-on-ones, and that happens through people coming together collectively. And then the next step is trying to build that organization, and that will come after. But really just developing the solidarity by talking to each other about what you're experiencing.
Thank you. Liz?
I think the education piece is really big, and knowing your rights. And Emma can be also a support source for that, but also the broader labor movement is here. You've got a whole table full of people who want to help. And so us being there to answer questions and encourage you along the way and support you. So knowing your rights, and then, as Justin said, talking to each other. You're used to living in an open source environment and solving problems collectively. Have those conversations with each other and think outside the box. I hate that saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. But you know, it's why not be brainstorming new ways of doing things, and we can be there as a labor movement infrastructure to support you along the way.
Awesome, thanks. Linda, what advice would you have for someone just starting out?
Yeah, I'd really stress the importance of one-on-one and the building trust amongst one another, and because when you're going through these organizing efforts, these are going to be the building blocks and the relationships you carry throughout every step of the way. You want to make sure that people are educated, you're talking to people, that people are involved and are excited to be involved. So one-on-ones are super important.
Yeah, and Kevin?
Yeah, I feel like I'm preaching to a choir here, but yeah, it is talking to your coworkers, talking to the people you work with, and figuring out their problems, building connections. Because, like, a lot of people in this industry are marginalized or feel isolated, and I believe that they're facing these problems alone, by themselves, when we're all facing those problems, and we want to stand up together to, like, fight for better conditions. So it's not just, like, figuring out what the problems are, right? It's building actual human connection to form, like, a culture of care, where we care about each other, we care about our problems, we care about solving the issues we're facing together.
Yeah, and I'll add my 2 cents. I think everyone kind of touched on it, really, but Kevin, you really articulated it. A fellow organizer once told me that to her, organizing is about building a culture of care in your workplace, right, and in your industry. And I think that's really kind of a profound and very sweet way to approach organizing, right? It's about building a culture of care. And that means actually listening to people, hearing their problems, genuinely caring, and like, it doesn't matter what their position are on unions and things, what role they play in the industry, genuinely approaching them with genuine empathy and care about their situation, and learning to listen first, and not just lecture and share stats and things, but focus on emotion and story. I think that's at least something I would definitely share with new organizers. Awesome. So we're going to move into the audience section. So if you have any questions or advice or that you want to seek from our panelists, there's a lot of really wonderful perspective and knowledge to share up here. So we could go all night, but we've got about 30 minutes. Yeah, we'll start over here.
Hello. What are the unique challenges presented by, say, an indie developer where you might be alone or working part-time in a different industry and in your free time making games?
Sure. Justin, you want to take that?
One thing that, as I've looked at and just starting to learn a little bit more about this industry, is that the independent development scene looks a little bit to me like the independent film scene in our union. And so oftentimes people will wear the hat, many different hats, and do many different things within a production. And so the things that have worked for our union in that space is the community building. And so we'll have an independent film caucus where people who are working in isolated situations can come together and talk about their craft, talk about funders, talk about the various issues that are impacting them as individually, and look for potential common solutions related to that, or just get together and talk to other human beings. Seems to be actually a value for folks in that. And then also the union has a contract that can be negotiated whereby you would be, if you're the indie game developer and you're working sort of as a self-owned or self-produced entity, that you can actually become signatory to the union contract and become eligible for health insurance. And that contract was developed as independent filmmakers got together and talked about ways in which that contract should be structured. And so indie, if by indie you also mean some smaller companies, then I think it's important to take an industry-wide approach so that not just one or two of them are unionized, but all of them are.
Well, I'm talking about people who are not in a shop specifically.
Yeah.
Can I add an additional part to that question?
Briefly.
Yeah. What about groups that already exist, say like the IGDA branch of your local thing? How will Game Workers Unite distinguish itself from that or be joined into that? Maybe they don't want to be joined into it, but the community already exists. I'm kind of like thinking of these like case scenarios, edge case scenarios.
I'd actually like to tackle that. For clarity, when it comes to labor organizing, it always happens on a shop-by-shop basis. It's a very local grassroots approach. Even if it's a part of a larger national or international movement, it's always about the individual workers in the shop coming together to find whatever path forward and whatever issues they want to work around and what solutions they want to find. And so in that way, it really is up to the individual groups of workers in their studios to find out their own path. And so, yeah, if they want to find community and solidarity in the IGDA or Game Workers Unite or any community really, that's wonderful. And Game Workers Unite is here to help with education and providing organizer training and kind of building up the general skills of the populace. But really, it's again about that local shop, and they might choose to go with any one existing union. They might choose to keep their own independent, just themselves union, right? They might also want to form, as a collective of other shops that are unionizing, a larger, like, national union, say. It's very flexible, and it's up to what the workers themselves decide. Does that provide a little clarity on that?
Yeah, thank you.
For sure.
If I could add a couple of thoughts here, that has been a debate around, traditionally we've seen people organized around craft. So, for example, I used my union, the electrical workers, where all electricians in the country, based on their craft, organized a union. Then you have also this sort of more horizontal industry example of, steel workers, in their companies would go across a company, no matter where that company's footprint was, they organized by the company in that particular industry. And sometimes you could have an industry-wide, all the companies coming together too at one table, where we've had models like that. But for folks who are independent, who aren't employees, there's a distinction there because under the National Labor Relations Act, you're not eligible, I guess, to form a traditional union as an independent contractor. So that's where we're seeing these new models emerge, where I mentioned the Uber Drivers Guild, where they still can come together collectively to leverage their strength, right? Because you're more powerful together than you are on your own. And so they're organizing in different ways. Car wash workers, taxi drivers, folks who have been on their own, feeling alone, have a way to come together and bargain or negotiate. So the AFL-CIO, I would say, is exploring this right now because we're doing a future of work initiative where we're thinking, how can the labor movement actually think more creatively, more fluidly about how work is going to be organized in the future? Because there is, as we know, this push to try to, employers to try to, skirt responsibility, to be honest, right? They don't want to be an employer anymore. Of course, we're going to fight that, but we also need to figure out a path forward for workers who want to come together in a different way. So it is about scale, and I would guess as someone who works on your own independently, you still want to have access to affordable health care. You still want to have access to, perhaps maybe one day buying a home and getting a mortgage, who knows, right? And also discounts on things that, when you are part of a large organization, you can get cheaper access to staying at a hotel or whatever it is. So I think we're looking at a model of how we can open up the labor movement scale to leverage that for workers who aren't necessarily employees, if that makes sense.
Thanks for the question. Yeah, over here.
So very similar to my question. So I'm a freelancer, and I've debated putting up on my website discounts for studios with union labor, that employs union labor. Is there any other way that freelancers can support our fellow workers in bigger studios than just discounts or showing up to meetings?
I feel like either Linda or Justin could probably tackle that. Linda, do you want to take a stab?
One of the things that, since we've started organizing in digital media, the folks that have been able to join the union and be part of the collective bargaining agreement are the staff workers at places. But just like in your industry, in the writing industry, there's many freelancers who are either doing an article here and there and are not eligible to join the union. And so we have a sort of an adjacent effort of freelance solidarity that happens where people who are in the freelance space come together at our union office and look for collective solutions to try to either increase the rates that they're part of or to support contract campaigns that places that they write for are part of. And so that requires, just like Liz was saying, thinking about things a little bit differently and adapting to the actual economy that's in front of us, which includes multiple freelance pools of labor and multiple ways that companies, frankly, are working to get around having traditional employee-employer relationships. So I think as long as a lot of the same things apply if you're freelance, and that's about building community, building collective power. If you look at some things the National Writers Union has done in terms of they've done lawsuits around non-payment for magazine publications and have been really innovating, doing new collective actions for freelancers. So I would argue that it's going to be extremely important to make sure that freelancers are part of any future unions within your industry.
Linda, do you want to touch on that as well?
Yeah, I think it's a matter of, what Justin touched upon. It's like where you have a space where you can also stay organized even if you're not particularly in that bargaining unit of the union. Because one example of SAG-AFTRA is that choreographers are not considered part of our union, but a lot of them actually are members because we do cover dancers. But then they created kind of like their own space, but also work closely with the union where, they call themselves the Choreographer Alliance and use this alliance model where they still, have a lot of autonomy where they can create their own meetings, they teach classes, do fundraising, and they still talk to one another and are able to actually create minimums for each other. So I think there's still ways like using kind of like that alliance model of like this is kind of like the on-ramp to activism and organizing, and they're able to do that, but also be in solidarity with the dancers and the union and work together.
I just want to add, because it works slightly differently in the UK. In the UK, even if you're a freelancer or contractor or you have no job, you're allowed to join the union. That is just a fundamental right of every person in the UK, that you have the right to join the union. And one of the things that we at like solidarity workers in the IWGB achieved is that for Deliveroo and Uber drivers, they formed a union for them. They successfully unionized, and in High Court, they thought that these couriers are recognized as employees with full employee rights, sick days, vacation, paternity, maternity leave. Because, I know it's slightly different, yes, but there's one thing that a lot of people work on like rolling contracts from years to like just a couple of weeks. That are actually like, they should be full-time employees, that should be bought in-house and just get a regular salary and regular benefits. And that is also something we're trying to fight for.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, another thing that we're experimenting with that might be relevant is bargaining for all. So that, for example, the UFCW commercial workers are in negotiations with big grocery stores, and they've invited non-union workers to their bargaining table because they're going to bargain for lifting standards for everyone. So that might be also an outlet in the future.
Thank you.
So there's been a lot of talk about organizing by trade specifically. Like Linda, you were saying, for example, that choreographers aren't included in SAG-AFTRA. Sorry. Can you talk a little bit about like a solidarity union model where you're organizing, you know, not necessarily just the game workers, but like everyone in the shop, like including janitorial staff, and using the leverage that game workers have as folks who have a little bit more of like specific skills and therefore leverage in order to raise the standards for workers in their shop who their bosses might see as more disposable, heavy air quotes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think that's really crucial. Do you want to tackle that? Or?
Yeah, so even to continue talking about choreographers, like we know that they have a super specialized skill set, and usually they will be in solidarity with the dancers because a lot of them grew up and trained as dancers and are part of our union because of dancing. So they would even show solidarity with the dancers where they can, you know, say that we want this to be covered, this project to be covered by union contract. And they've been building, and then the choreographers will go to other shows, like say they go on tour with a musical artist where they're like, okay, and then they still float that idea because the choreographer, there's a smaller set of choreographers doing this kind of work, and then they're constantly getting work. So if they go to, like, say on tour, then they can also float that idea of like, we want this to be, you know, covered by union contract, we want union dancers, and, you know, help organize in that way so that there is that solidarity and that education going on, and they were able to, that's still like an ongoing effort to organize music tours, but they were able to do it with the Justin Timberlake tour in 2012, and then recently he went on tour last year, and then that they were able to make that a union tour as well.
Awesome. And yeah, and I would just further expand by emphasizing that at least for me, and I think a lot of people in Game Workers Unite, we really do buy into the industrial model of organizing, which kind of, as you were describing, means,
Yeah, that's
you know,
exactly what I was describing.
Yeah, to reiterate is kind of, yes, about like organizing all workers across all disciplines, because it's a little harder to separate people when we're all banded together in one big group. And I think a part of that absolutely is organizing all workers. If you have any role to play in the work of our companies and our studios making games, and I mean genuinely like engineers, artists, writers, QA testers, right, community managers, I mean the folks who work down in the cafeteria or who maintain the building, everyone's playing a hand here, right? Like everyone's enabling this medium that we work in, right? And I think it's super essential to, yeah, as we've been saying, include everyone when we're trying to improve our workplaces. Yeah.
And a
Great,
campus,
thank you.
an ex-
Oh, sorry.
example might also be with campuses. We've been seeing, that solidarity come around on college campuses where you have, obviously the faculty, you've got the grad students organizing, you've got cafeteria workers, and they're leveraging, each other's strengths. In some cases, the whole campus is organized, and they help the cafeteria workers lift up their voice. And also in Silicon Valley, we have an example of what we call Silicon Valley Rising, where you saw at Facebook and Google and other places where shuttle bus drivers, cafeteria workers, and security guards organized a union because of the support in the Silicon Valley area of all the other labor unions coming together, lifting them up and using every tool at our disposal, whether it's capital strategies with our pension funds and leveraging, at shareholders meetings, it's, a legislative and regulatory pressure strategy to get the company to pay attention, media, so we bring all those tools to bear together in a particular geographical area to help workers who may not necessarily have as much of a voice.
And to button that, I would also say, I think we genuinely have a lot to learn from those people who have organized, right? Those cafeteria workers, those shuttle workers, those maintenance folks. We have much to learn from them, and they are already doing that work in our studios, right? In our companies, right? At Facebook and other places. So we have a lot to learn from them, and I think that's a healthy relationship we should be continuing to develop. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for coming. So there are entire parts of the video game industry that rely on free labor that generates money for companies, for example, like streaming or like kids making skins for Minecraft. Like another more well-known example of this from another industry are like BuzzFeed quizzes. And I'm just wondering, how has this happened in other sites of organizing, and how has it been addressed? And are these people considered to be workers? Are we bringing them into these efforts? Thank you.
So you're kind of talking about community-made labor and products of labor.
Yeah.
How does that fit into this?
Yeah.
Awesome question. Does anyone want to tackle that?
I mean, one thing I did with the UK and from a union is deciding on who's eligible to join. Like, where do you draw the line? Is it a professional esports players that get a salary from the company that makes the game? Are they considered game workers? Freelance games journalists? Like, where do we, people who work on middleware for games, who work on like Havoc, are they considered game workers? And one of the things you arrived at is that anybody who is involved in the process of making games at some level is in the union. But when it comes to like user-generated content, when it comes to like modders or YouTubers, Twitchers, streamers, professional esports players, there we draw the line because like the games industry is like a very big space where it is hard to get like the solidarity you need from all the workers. So like until we can like really get a foothold in this industry, we don't want to stretch ourselves too thin and like try to cover too many bases.
Maybe Linda or Justin, I think this is kind of slightly also related to things like spec work. And in the industry, we kind of, definitely have an issue with people requesting spec work, which for those who aren't familiar are, requesting essentially free labor, free examples of, your creativity or ability before actually hiring you or paying you, right? We even had a very notable example at last E3 where Ubisoft had a program that was essentially asking for community spec work. Is that common in maybe your industry, I would assume, as well, maybe?
Yeah, that's even in the film and television industry and for script writing, it's quite common. And the way that folks have addressed that is through a collective bargaining agreement that sets out the standards for what people are paid for doing labor. And in order to get there just needs to be a common understanding of the people who are doing that work and a shared responsibility to hold each other accountable to not working for free. But that problem definitely doesn't go away with a union because people are doing work that they are passionate about and they care about and are trying to break into an industry. So that's definitely a challenge with or without a union, frankly.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hi. Any advice for students who, especially undergrad, who want to raise awareness and stuff in schools that sometimes the teachers are a bit more old-fashioned about this, especially because I don't want to rest on my laurels and say, oh, it'll be solved by the time I graduate. We'll have a union by then.
Yeah, does anyone want to tackle the kind of subject of students and how they fit in?
As far as activism?
Yeah, and getting them involved.
Yeah, there's an organization called United Students Against Sweatshops that is very active on campuses, speaking out. Of course, the motivator for them, or the reason why they formed, was because of the college athletic wear that was being sold on campus, was being made in sweatshops in other countries, and they wanted to change the standards for what they could sell on campus, right? We want clothing that's made using, folks who are being paid a fair wage and aren't being taken advantage of. So that activism kind of branched out and now is, I think, a very fluid organization that turns over in leadership quite often because the nature of students coming and going. But it's been evergreen, and I don't know, you could look them up online probably. But also, you're able to start a chapter of your own if you want at your campus in terms of connecting with the players in your community and being a voice on campus for the organizing that's going on in the community.
I would also say there's kind of an inverse relationship, too, to be mindful of. At least with Game Workers Unite, we do a lot of work around preparing education materials for students about, not just the reality of the industry, but also basics of how to advocate for yourself in the workplace and things. And I think it's super important that we include student voices in our organizing work because even though they might not be workers now, they certainly will be in a few years. And this industry is really hard for new people. Jumping in can feel like going right into the deep end. And I think as much as we can prepare people for it is really essential. So your voice and any student's voices are super welcome and appreciated in the movement, and I would encourage everyone to get involved for sure.
Okay, thank you.
We probably have time for about one more.
Yeah, so yesterday we spoke a bit about how in a union you can't have anyone who's got a hiring and firing power. And looking at the business cards you've been giving out, there's lots of executives on there, but there's no supervisors, there's no lead developers, and a lot of these people would be exploited as well by the executive class. They would be at risk of layoffs, like frontline workers. Is there a labour organisation model where, us frontline workers can unite with them to form a united front against the highest levels in the companies?
Nothing that I'm familiar with. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, yeah.
The echo was really hard for me to hear.
I think the question was about people being part of the labor unions who are technically under labor law statutory supervisors or otherwise ineligible, right? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah. So basically, like low to mid-level managers who would also be at risk from abuse from executives, and how they can help us form a united front against this kind of executive overpay.
We've been, the organizing that we've been doing since 2015 has been all outside of the National Labor Relations Board. The National Labor Relations Board is the entity that enforces the National Labor Relations Act, and that is, to us, essentially a law that is designed in many ways to prevent workers from organizing, and so we've been operating outside of that law, which gives us tremendous flexibility in terms of bargaining unit composition, meaning that people that law may consider to be supervisors or managers or otherwise unable to join a union can in fact join the unions that are being formed at the companies where people are working. And that requires tremendous solidarity of the people that are organizing, and it's much more difficult to have folks like that included, and you have to leverage the company to agree to that through using direct action tactics and public shaming and whatever else you can find in your arsenal, up to and including the threat of withholding your labor in a strike. But we have found it to be useful to have unions that have more people in them, who sometimes have more power in them, to get better things from the company. But it's definitely a challenge.
I would also tack onto this that I know you're from Ireland, and so something to note also is that we're talking about the National Labor Relations Board, and that's very U.S. centric. And I think the thing to really say is that the legal framework and context around labor and unions and things really does vary a lot by country to country, and that's something that would just have to be researched for your actual communities and studios. But yeah, to kind of build off of what Justin was saying, it isn't terribly uncommon that managers and supervisors, creative leads, things like that, can be sometimes included in an organizing campaign. And I think just to extra emphasize something I think Justin was hinting at is I think it's really crucial that when you're organizing with those types of folks, one, I would say you bring them on a little bit after when you've already organized many of the kind of base level workers. And secondly, when you're organizing, ensure that the actual structures of the organization and how you run things and how voices are represented in the democratic structure of the union is taking into account the kind of natural power dynamics that some of these leads and directors and supervisors tend to have in the company. So that way they're not overrunning anyone's voice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One small point is the scenario we see most often is very confrontational. But there are scenarios where employers and managers actually will work with you to form a union. And they are rare, but they do happen.
Absolutely.
And I guess we should maybe approach it always first with the rationale that, hey, we're in this together. We're creating value at this company. When we do better, you do better. We all want to see this company succeed. So we want to form a union just so that we have a seat at the table. And we want to be a shareholder, so to speak, and have a voice. And so I come from a tradition where that is the case. Labor and management are together in lockstep because we are the skilled, trained talent that make them money, and they know it. So the union benefits them in this way. So I guess that's one thought I had when you were talking about management, is that we can't always assume that they're our enemy. And because in some cases, middle management benefit when there's a union in the company, right? Because we're raising that lifting tide, or that raising tide lifts all boats, that the managers actually end up benefiting when there's a union in the workplace.
Yeah, and I think, of course, it's always throughout that process, even if we go in with good intentions and assuming the best of folks, always having that kind of caveat there,
Absolutely.
That the relationship is inherently one where the workers and the bosses have different needs and interests.
Absolutely. That's more common, yes.
Yeah, and yeah, I think that's a wonderful question. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Yeah. So we are now out of time. Thank you for the panelists for being here today. It's really awesome to hear all your perspectives and voices. Thank you for your questions. Some of them I actually hadn't heard before, and so I think having these conversations and these trickier questions are really, really helpful. I also want to say thank you to our wonderful techs who are running the conference. They're our siblings in labor at the IATSE Local 16. Every single session that you've been at this week has been run by union labor, yeah? And it is them who make this conference as smooth and wonderful as it is, so we are deeply grateful. Thank you for doing the work that you do. I also want to super thank all of our CAs who are just doing an amazing job. They have so much on their plates, but they do it with such passion and kindness and just endless support. And your labor is also very much valued. Even though you're only here 1 week out of the year, you are still doing very excellent labor, and we recognize that, and we wish you the best as well. And finally, I would also say, please thank all of the service workers who are working around the conference. The people working at Moscone and Yerba Buena work very hard to make sure that this place is a safe and comfortable environment that's clean and friendly and very approachable. So please do thank them when you're kind of spending your final day here at GDC. And then, yeah, lastly, I would just say I'm supposed to remind you that you'll have an email in your inbox for evaluations. Please do fill them out. They are very helpful for both the conference and those of us up here who, really would appreciate the feedback on how the panel was run and what kind of content you'd like to see in the future, right? And then finally, we have a roundtable, a community roundtable, just in 15, 20 minutes. It's in the South Hall in room 216. And we would really encourage everyone to come out. We're going to have a really great discussion about next steps and talking about granular problems we're all facing and how people can get involved. And we would love all your voices to be there as well. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to Emma.
Developers against each other. So this is we really don't want to fall down that hole again where they're pitting, workers against other workers, because, the more people that are organized, the better industry standards we can create. So, SAG-AFTRA totally supports this, the voice actors totally support this. So any way we can support, we're all for it. And this is super exciting for us.
Thank you.